The letter from 150 people on free speech published by Harper's magazine has prompted a furious debate on cancel culture. A few days after it was published, we can now evaluate the merit or otherwise of the strongest arguments against it. So let's have a look. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. The debate around free speech kicked into high gear recently with the publication of a letter in Harper's signed by over 150 people, some of them extremely well-known names. I covered this briefly in my weekly roundup video, but since there have been some detailed responses to the letter, it's worth looking at more closely. I don't pretend to be impartial when it comes to free speech generally. It's a principle I've been a strong advocate for all my life, but the question of whether cancel culture is actually a negation of free speech is a more recent discussion. And as with all things, you should aim to seek out the strongest arguments against your own position to see if it survives the challenge. So let's do that here. The thing that drew attention to the Harper's letter was that nearly all the names were people of the left, whereas in recent years arguments supporting free speech have mostly been coming from the political right. It was a reminder that not much in this is fixed. After all, one of the signatories is Salman Rushdie, who 32 years ago had a death sentence, a fatwa, announced against him by Iran because of his book, The Satanic Verses. I think it may even have been that first made me so strongly in support of free speech. Not 100% sure. At that point, it was people on the left mostly defending him, with the exception of a few Labour MPs like Jack Straw, who had large numbers of Muslims in their constituency, while politicians on the right, such as Norman Tebbit and Geoffrey Howe, attacked him. Luckily, no one's handing out death sentences today, so that's something to be grateful for at least. But the rise of the debate around cancel culture has seen real consequences handed out to a raft of other people. So it's become a point of conflict all over again. Let's first of all look at what were the key points from the original letter, and then we'll look at the nature of the responses. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. Censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture, and intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty, which is effectively the description of cancel culture without using the name. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter-speech from all quarters, but it's now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. So this isn't about saying free speech can go unchallenged, robust, and even caustic challenge is good. Good news for YouTube commenters. But that's different to severe retribution, which most commonly, of course, means people being sacked and being held to have become unemployable by implication. More troubling still, institutional leaders in the spirit of panicked damage control are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. And this is key. The Twitter mobs have no power unless the institutions, the employers and the other gatekeepers cave in and deliver the consequences that people are calling for. Which, of course, they have been doing. Reliably, predictably, which is what's given the whole thing its power. Probably why we're even talking about it right now. Without it, it's just a bunch of people whining on Twitter. The letter then gives a list of unidentified examples, but which are easily identifiable. And I've talked about some of them on this channel before. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organisations are ousted for what's sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. And then it finishes with this basic call to the classic free speech argument, which I've repeated here many times. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. There were numerous responses, most of which were based on similar ideas. Of the more lengthy ones that I saw, there was one with more signatures, albeit less well-known names, on The Objective, a thoughtful one on Tech Dirt, and an extremely snarky one on In These Times. It's fair to say that although a number of the vocal free speech advocates were welcoming of the initiative, that didn't hold true for all. Some, like Dave Rubin, responded by sniffily observing that some of the signatories had perhaps done their own share of shaming and cancelling in their time, which is no doubt true. But whether that's the highest priority thing to focus on is questionable. You can always remind people in the future of what they've signed up to. Punishing people for doing the right thing on the grounds they didn't necessarily always do the right thing in the past, it's bordering on a mild version of cancel culture in itself. Let's just note that and move on because it's not the central point. So, reviewing the responses, they come down to the following. 1. These are privileged people whining about being silenced when none of them have been. 2. Cancel culture isn't a thing. A few things may have happened, but not enough to make a trend. And there are plenty of places for people to speak their mind, so free speech is hardly being constrained. 3. Most of those things that have happened were simple justice. Freedom for consequences is not the same as free speech. You're free to say what you like, but actions have consequences, and you have to take the results of your own actions. And 4. Really, those consequences just count as counter-speech, the thing that the letter writers claim to be in support of. They just seem not to want to have any counter-speech directed at them. On Twitter, of course, there were a certain number of people doing exactly what the letter describes, going after some of the signatories for daring to sign a letter also signed by their biggest hate figure, which was usually J.K. Rowling. Several of those signatories quickly recanted, which makes you wonder just how much thought they'd put into making the statement in the first place. That's almost a by the by here. The benefit of a letter like the Harper's letter is that it flushes out the strongest, or at least the most widely held, arguments against. And I do think that what we see here goes to the heart of the philosophical divide that's fueling the anger and division that we're currently seeing. So let's look at these arguments one by one. First, that the identity and relative success of the signatories is a relevant factor. This seems to take the starting premise that their motivation is to complain on behalf of themselves, which could be seen basically as an ad hominem attack because the examples they give are not of their own experiences, but editors, academics and others that were vulnerable to attack. J.K. Rowling is not one of those. For all that it probably grieves her, for lots of good people have now taken the propaganda line that she somehow has been spewing hate and bile, which is ridiculous if you look at what she's actually said. Her publisher stood by her. She has enough money to be pretty much invulnerable to the impact of cancellation anyway. Unlike the other author, who was sacked for sending out a tweet saying that she supported J.K. Rowling. So this is the challenge at the heart of this response. This letter got attention because of the profile of its signatories. People in that position have a platform, which they are using, in this case, to highlight an issue from within the community to which they see themselves as belonging. It's an extremely valuable thing when people with influence do that on behalf of those who don't have such influence. So, is it an argument against because the people making the argument have a degree of prestige? Traditionally, not at all, because the argument should stand or fall on its own merits. It's either right or it isn't, regardless of where the argument came from. Traditionally, the beneficiaries of free speech have very often been the less powerful, because those are the ones most easily silenced. But that brings us to the second part of this, because in the identity politics world, it's argued that the identity of those making the argument absolutely does matter. The argument is that different standards should apply. The counter letter in The Objective says most of the signatories are white, wealthy and endowed with massive platforms. And it says, in truth, Black, brown and LGBTQ plus people, particularly black and trans people, can now critique elites publicly and hold them accountable socially. This seems to be the letter's greatest concern. Obviously, the Harper's letter says nothing about black, brown, trans or any specific people, and this is the point. The perspective of the original letter is that these are universal principles. Freedom of speech only counts if it's freedom of speech for everyone, and that upholding that universal principle ultimately benefits the whole of society. And at the heart of the critic is a rejection of that principle. Certain voices matter more than other voices, because voices of people that have been oppressed in the past must be amplified now. It's no longer about let the best arguments win, it's about rectifying power imbalance. What the people making that argument probably don't even notice is that saying authors are white and privileged is an argument like it says so in the Bible is an argument. If the other person doesn't accept or even just isn't familiar with the authority that you're quoting, then the argument has no power. To people who believe that there's such a thing as objective truth and universal justice based on common values, then the whole purpose of free speech is that arguments can be heard, orthodoxies can be challenged, and we can arrive at truth and fairness. If alternatively your position is that that very concept is a subjective one, designed to advance the interests of a privileged elite, then it becomes an argument that has no common points of reference on which you can have a discussion. You're just doomed to talk past each other. And so you end up answering not the words people say, but the dark intent your us versus them perspective leads you to impute. Again, from the objective counter letter, the writers of the letter use seductive but nebulous concepts and coded language to obscure the actual meaning behind their words, in what seems like an attempt to control and derail the ongoing debate about who gets to have a platform. Obviously, there are no words in that letter that match such an attempt. We generally see that as a straw man argument, a misrepresentation of the other person's case in a way that can be easily knocked down. Okay, the second point, that cancel culture isn't a thing. It may happen sometimes, it's not enough to be a trend. This argument was put forward by Mike Masnick on Tech Dirt. Yes, there are examples of people being shut down for expressing their ideas, but it is much less common than people would have you believe. Maybe that's right. It could be the equivalent of the phenomenon where everyone thinks violent crime is more prevalent than it is because such crime is heavily reported, and people therefore overestimate how common it is. But then cancel culture doesn't require that large numbers of people are actually losing their jobs left, right and centre. In some way, fear of being cancelled is cancel culture because it leads to an atmosphere of self-censorship in exactly the same way that people end up with a higher fear of crime. That said, although that seems to be the argument Masnick is making, he actually undermines that perception in the next sentence where he says this: in many cases, what people are complaining about is not that their speech is being shut down, but that they are facing consequences for their speech being ridiculous. So it actually turns out that he thinks more of it's happening, he just thinks that it's justified, and so shouldn't be described as lack of freedom. So since none of them make a concerted attempt to argue for a different reason why it's not that big a deal, let's move straight on to that next one, since they're effectively the same point. So, point 3, that these are the justified consequences of free speech. Mike Masnick again. What the signatories here seem to be requesting is not more free speech. They appear to be asking for freedom from consequences for their own speech. Please don't publicly shame us or make our bosses rethink our employment for our speech, no matter how bad it is. That is not a pro-free speech stance, it is an anti-consequences stance. And it's truly disappointing to see many of the signatories endorse this. So this point suggests that there is no limit to the scale of consequences that can be fairly applied to someone having an idea that you don't like. But obviously there is a limit. For example, if I said to you that, of course you have free speech, but one of the consequences of you disagreeing with me is that I will shoot you, we would be pretty clear that was not a valid consequence to any real or imagined offence you might cause just by speaking. If you say something I find offensive, and that means I don't like you anymore, I don't buy your books, don't follow you on Twitter, and I express my opinion about you, that seems a natural consequence. So then the question is, what's in the middle? Where does it fall when people organise to harry an employer until they fire someone? Where they try to ensure they don't get hired as a freelancer, that they don't get to be on a public platform, because their view is to be considered toxic to society as a whole, not just something that you don't happen to like. These are real harms. Generally, those attacking the Harper's letter have conceded one specific point. Even though they think most of those quoted as having been cancelled really deserved it, they concede it's probably not the case when it comes to David Shor. David Shor tweeted a link to an academic article, a peer-reviewed paper, that talked about how 1960s black protests probably led to the Nixon election. For that, the Black Lives Matter mob turned on him and he got fired. Masnick says this: the story of David Shor in that article is certainly one that many people pointed out, and it does highlight what seems like an overreaction. Shor appears to have been fired for merely tweeting a link to a study about historical voting patterns in response to violent versus non-violent protests, and some somewhat ridiculously interpreted the conclusions of that study to somehow be a condemnation of some of the current protests. Because if it had been a condemnation, then that would have been valid cause for him to get fired, right? Really? But here's the thing. After lots of people called out what happened to Shor, more speech, many people now agree that his firing was wrong. And so the cycle continues. Speech, counter-speech, more counter-speech, etc. Well, no, it's not speech, counter-speech. It's speech, firing and personal harm, counter-speech. Because at the end of all of that, David Shor is still fired. And isn't that kind of the point? Speech, counter-speech would have meant that you discussed the issue without causing the speaker personal harm. As far as he's concerned, it's just one of these things. Sometimes in the midst of all that speech, bad things happen, such as the firing of Shor. But is that an example of cancel culture run amok, or one bad result out of millions? Mistakes are sometimes made. It's impossible to get it right every time. What? You mean mob rule sometimes makes mistakes? Really? Still, just one time out of millions, so that's reassuring. We have this thing called the law. We decide what constitutes social ills when somebody does something which causes genuine harm and from which society should be protected. Sometimes those things are grey areas with multiple interests and complex issues. So we have representatives who are held accountable. They debate and spend long periods of time to come up with rules that are then spelled out in detail so we can all understand them and are clear to everybody. When those rules get changed, they get changed in public, and people who will lose out can make representations so their case is heard before the rules change. Then, if people get accused of having transgressed one of those rules, there's this thing called due process, where evidence is gathered and you get to hear both sides before making a decision. It's a pretty good system. We've agreed that if somebody incites violence against somebody, that's not covered by free speech. There are laws, and society can impose harms on the people who deliberately do it. But what Masnick's arguing for is the right of a mob to cause someone harm over an imagined infraction or a real one that offends their own rules, which, let's be clear, sometimes those rules were made up yesterday. Causing someone to lose their job or lose a platform is a real harm. What gives you the right to dispense justice as judge and jury? The law! And it's not just that when it goes so wrong that you can't even justify it, you just shrug your shoulders and say, well, mistakes happen. But you don't even do that when you cause harm to someone whose only crime is that they have an opinion different to you. One of the most recent people to come under attack is the actress Jodie Comer. What did she say or do to attract the swarms seeking to do her harm? Nothing. She's dating someone believed to be a Republican. Did he say something wicked and evil? Nope. But he might have voted for Trump. And that fact alone is sufficient to assume he must be a vicious racist. This is fascism, straight out fascism. The Republican Party is one of the two mainstream parties of government in the US. You don't have to like them, but to seek to do people harm because they have a different political position to you, or that they're dating someone who does, that is fascism. Unless you can persuade an elected government to agree that having an opinion different to you is a harm to society worthy of legislation, you have no right to seek harms to people on the grounds that they said something that is in no other way criminal. Full stop. But no, says Masnick, getting people fired isn't harm. It's just counter-speech. Public shaming and ostracism are literally examples of counter-speech and open debate. In other words, this sentence appears to be complaining about the very thing the authors claim to be supporting, counter-speech. Public shaming and ostracism are the consequences of speech that a group feels is ridiculous, problematic, dangerous, or otherwise not worth spreading widely. A group? Which group? What if my group feels that your speech is ridiculous, problematic, dangerous, and otherwise not worth spreading widely? Because I have to tell you, I'm kind of trending that way. Can I get you shamed and possibly fired and call that counter speech? I mean, maybe not, because my group, if I even have one, doesn't believe in shaming people as part of a mob. It believes in law and due process, innocent until proven guilty. There's a reason why due process exists. So since your mob is bigger and not overly fussed about due process, does that just mean that you win because you're bigger and meaner than everyone else? Is that it? What an utterly delinquent might equals right philosophy. We might be talking about ostracism rather than sending people to the guillotine, but otherwise this is exactly the worst part of the French Revolution. It's saying that back in history certain mobs would lynch people and that was bad, but now it's our turn. So we're going to do the modern equivalent and that will be good. The scale of the harm is the only thing that's different. But what about the argument that it's counter-speech? I mean, I'd thought of counter-speech as something that started along the lines of, I think you're wrong about that because... ... Or even in the style of many YouTube commenters, you're a blithering idiot to say that, and here's why. Fine, it's all good. But if instead I go to your employer and say, how do you feel about employing someone with this opinion? Well, that's just speech, isn't it? And if I organise my mob of hundreds to ask the same question, that's just 100 times more speech, isn't it? No, because you're genuinely commissioning harm, the same as if you were inciting someone to hurt them. Unless what somebody said genuinely calls into question their ability to do their job, in which case drawing it to the employer's attention once is the only duty you might have, not mobbing them. But of course, you can concoct some flimsy rationale to make that case for any transgression. So some have argued that J.K. Rowling shouldn't be allowed to write children's books again because she spouts hateful, transphobic speech that could be damaging to young minds. And this is where due process comes in. Because on the current history, an objective review of what's actually been said would find insufficient evidence to prove such a case, not on the basis of law, which of course is why people who are full of their own moral certainty don't believe in due process. The ends justify the means. We know someone's bad. We shouldn't be slowed down by these bureaucratic, bothersome rules that maybe were created by white people just to deny justice to people like us. So here's the conclusion. The responses to the Harper's letters have been instructive. The case they've made is this. We believe in one rule for us and a different one for the other side. We believe your speech is violence, but ours is justice. We believe that we have every moral right to cause you real harm for your opinion, for your beliefs, or even just for associating with someone who we would just generally consider to be suspect. Masnick suggests that when they do, it's a question of speaking truth to power, taking the truth part as self-evident, obviously. When the other side do it, it's called using a position of privilege to keep down the less fortunate. Note, no one's calling for Masnick or any of the others to be fired, but you can definitely take this video as an example of counter-speech.